Well, good morning, everyone. This is March 1st. Can you believe it, March? Here we are, and there are no tulips. So anyway, I'm very upset about that, but it is March 1, 2023. We are here this morning for two things. First of all, an important work session on freight rail dependent uses. And then secondly, after that, immediately after, we'll turn to council time. So we begin with the work session. And Kathleen, would you like to introduce the staff who will be presenting? I see Oliver there online.
Yes, so Oliver from Community Planning will be presenting this morning as a background for the freight rail dependent uses overlay overview. And hopefully, based on this information, of course, staff is there to answer council's questions and get direction from council on how you'd like to proceed.
Okay, good morning, councillors, Madam Chair and councillors. For the record, Oliver Ojak, and with me this morning is Jose Alvarez, who is our project lead on this effort. So we will be presenting the freight rail dependent use overlay, providing next slides. So this is the agenda that we will be covering today in our presentation, but the focus really is going to be on what has happened since the passage of the Freight Rail Dependent Use Bill. The bill, known as Engrossed Senate Bill 5517, was passed in 2017. And that bill became effective October 19, 2017. And the bill also has is codified in several parts of RCW, which we have listed here. One of the things I would like the council to be aware is that this bill is an amendment to the Growth Management Act, but that amendment really focused on the definitions of freight rail dependent uses. It also provides for a definition of short line railroad, followed by the two counties where they can or they may, and the bill uses the word may, develop development regulations to allow for freight rail dependent uses. And as I indicated, these are the several parts of the RCW as the bill is codified, and we will go through that. We will then provide the council an overview, in other words, the steps that Clark County has taken to try to implement the bill. One of the first steps the county took is in phase 1 by adoption of a county plan policy and using the overlay designation as an approach, followed by draft proposed development use and development standards. We will get into conversation and discussion we had with the council at the time and the direction that they gave staff and at what time did they ask us to, or they pause for any work on the bill itself. What I would like to also provide or let the council know that on the project web page or website, it has a detailed information on the extensive public outreach and effort that the county has taken to date, and we will provide a link to that project web page where anyone can find many informations, surveys, other things that the county did to try to implement this bill. So with that, I will turn it over to Jose Alvarez, who will go over the remainder of the presentation. And I am here, as well as our legal counsel, to answer questions that the councilors may have. As the county manager indicated, whatever direction that the council provide, I will be following up with the county manager to see how we proceed. You may not do that today. You can do that at your council time, consideration, deliberation, and voting on what you would like us to do. So with that, let me turn it over to Jose Alvarez. And again, I am here to help answer questions that council may have. Jose, take it away.
Thank you, Oliver. All right. Good morning, Council. I'm Jose Alvarez with Clark County Community Planning. As Oliver mentioned, this Gross Bill 5517 was passed. It's a bill that passed and amended the Growth Management Act. It allows Clark and Okanogan counties to create development regulations that would allow freight rail dependent uses adjacent to short line railroads on rural and resource lands. The idea was to encourage economic development by taking advantage of an existing asset, the rail line, and making it more viable by increasing the amount of land that could potentially use the rail line. The sections that were amended are RCW 3670A 030 is the definition section. 060 is the natural resource lands and critical areas. And then 108 is the transportation element. Next slide, please.
Can we pause on that slide? I have a question on the last bullet. So the last bullet, the way I read it, and I've read all these sections and statute and the original enabling law, that last bullet looks like a legal determination that I didn't see is in agreement with the actual intent of the legislation. I know I have found no published opinion, AG opinion, or otherwise that codifies that last bullet. And so I'm wondering where that comes from.
I think that's the exact language that's in the legislation, but we'll get to that in a moment. Next slide.
Excuse me, but could you possibly address that now while we're looking at it?
I'm going to show you the exact language so you can compare it.
And
That would be helpful.
Yeah, councilors, this is Olive again, and we provided a link to the bill itself, but we will go through, the council can look at the bill itself and the sections that we provided as is codified in RCW. You know, the bill is, you know, one can look at it and say, here is the bill. We go to the revised code of Washington because in our mind, that is the statute language. So, but we will get to that so you can see exactly what that section provides.
We understand. I was just asking to complement what Councilor Medvigi said. If we could see that before us right now, since we are seeing that particular fifth bullet, that would be helpful. It's fresh in our minds. It would be good to see it now.
Okay, Jose, can you go to, if we can advance to that slide? I think it is, I believe it's likely that it may be slide, looking at mine, it may be slide 7.
Oliver, on this slide where it actually calls out the RCWs and stuff, on all of them, do we have slides showing the exact language?
Yes, I think it's slide
7.
7.
Yes, that's the, yes. So you can see the last
Council, do
sentence.
you want, so each of those items will be in the presentation in the language in full. Do you want him to jump just on the one bullet point and go to that slide?
Yes, because we were questioning that.
Okay, because all of the references are, the languages in the presentation, so.
So councilors, Jose, you can go to read.
So this is the slide that's being referred to, slide 7. The last sentence, such counties and cities may also modify development regulations to include development of freight rail dependent uses that do not require urban governmental services in rural lands.
And councillors, the only thing Oliver will add is that if you read the bill itself, it is the same language is in section, I believe it's section 5, item 2. So you can go to the bill itself and see that section and the item itself. I believe it's section 5, item 2. If I'm mistaken, I stand corrected, but I think this is the language as is codified in RCW 3670A108 item 2. So this is the language.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I didn't bring my annotated version of the statute, and I don't recall that specific language, and it's certainly in my mind inconsistent with other provisions of the enabling statute itself. So thanks for highlighting that. I'll refocus on that issue.
And while we are here, councillors, if we have time, the first, the agenda on the background, the slide 2, where we provided the bill itself, you can click on that and go to the section that I cited. It is in there too. That's why we provided a link to the bill. Continue, Jose.
Okay. If we can go back to slide 4.
Chair, real quick question. Are we just, are we going to go through the entire presentation and then have questions afterwards, or are we going to stop at the point of the presentation where we have a question? I just would like to clarify.
I would say a little bit of both, if that's okay with you, Jose and Oliver, so that we don't get too deep into the content and forget what we wanted to bring up. Does that sound good? But then at the end, of course, is where we typically ask questions.
Sure.
Sure, councillors.
Thank you. So, does that make sense? Go ahead, please.
Okay, so this slide 4 is the essentially the 2 definitions that were added, freight rail dependent uses, and also the short line railroad, and it references the Surface Transportation Board. So the definition of freight rail dependent uses there talks about the buildings and infrastructure that are the fabrication, processing, storage. You can read that, and it excludes coal, liquefied natural gas, or crude oil. Next slide, please. This 0601A is the section that actually identifies the location of Clark County, and that's the underlined language there. County located west of the crest of the Cascade Mountains and has a population of at least 400,000 and at a border that touches another state. Next slide, please. And 1E is the section of language that talks about Okanogan County and defines that. Next slide, please. This is the transportation section that we looked at, which we just discussed. Next slide. So the bill defined the freight rail dependent uses as buildings and other infrastructure that are used in the fabrication, processing, storage, and transport of goods where the use is dependent on and makes use of an adjacent short line railroad. The bill, like I said, excludes the coal, liquefied natural gas, and crude oil. Those highlighted items were some of the things that were the focus of some of the discussions with our advisory committee in phase 2 when we were looking at developing the use list and some definitions for these words. Next slide, please. So as Oliver mentioned earlier, the bill was passed in October of 2017. A month later, in November, the county decided to implement the new law in two phases. The first phase was to amend our comprehensive plan to adopt policy language that reflects the changes that were made to the Growth Management Act and an overlay map where the development could occur. The second phase was to adopt development standards and the uses that would be allowed. Next slide, please. So in January of 2018, Council amended several elements of the comprehensive plan, including the land use, the rural and natural resource element, transportation elements of the comp plan to be consistent with the newly adopted bill. So we took a lot of language from that bill and put that into our comp plan policies. The council also adopted an overlay map. That's the area outlined in red, which includes parcels within 500 feet of the rail line, and excludes the R5 properties on the southeast side of the rail line, and also stopped short of the Brushbury Rural Center to the north. Part of the reason for the geography to the north was the limitation of environmental work that we had already done in the 2007 comprehensive plan, where we brought in some of these areas to be light industrial. Those were subsequently removed from the urban growth boundary due to challenges at the Growth Management Hearings Board. It also extended east of the rail line and east of 503. The 500-foot was what we had come up with originally for a definition of adjacent to the rail line. Next slide, please.
Yeah, and so before we move off of that, on the point where you're, because I may have missed it, this, I'm trying to learn the history of where the council went and where your recommendations were that limited the short line to only half of a short line from Battleground South. What I just heard was that there was something in the comp plan or conservation issues north of Battleground that limited your work.
No.
And so I wanted you to focus on that and give me a little bit more detail and when that work was done in relation to when the law was actually passed, because it seems that this comp work that may have been done at the last comp plan prior to the FRDU needs to be revisited.
Okay, so what's in 2007 and again in 2016, in 2007, the urban growth area included this land as the outer limit and looked at this land as potentially being industrial. And so it was in our EIS work, that area was looked at and considered. There's no area north of here that went through that environmental assessment. Since that hadn't happened, there would have been a delay in looking at that area north of here to do that environmental assessment. And that would have taken more time and would have limited the ability to adopt this overlay. So that was really the kind of deciding factor. Battleground, the railroad runs through Battleground. Between this area and Battleground has never been studied for urban industrial uses, and north of Battleground hasn't been studied for industrial uses.
And if I may add, councillors, this overlay map was adopted, I believe, in 2018. And correct me if I'm wrong. So the bill was passed in 2000, became effective October 9th, 2017. So we wouldn't have already made a decision, or the council wouldn't have already adopted an overlay prior to the passage of the bill itself. So this action occurred, I believe, in January, or I can't remember when, but it was in 2018 that the councilors at the time approved this overlay. And in their guidance to staff, as Jose indicated, 500 feet on both sides of the railroad was considered adjacent. And we will get into other recommendation that was made by advisory group.
So thank you for that, Oliver. And I'm aware of what happened in 2017 and then pretty much nothing after that. So just focusing on process, what I just heard Jose say is that really the work done north wasn't done because there hadn't been environmental assessments and it would have delayed an overlay being put in place. So I think I understand that. So as far as process, is what I envision is something different. You know, just focusing on and I know there was a lot of angst and a lot of going back and forth on whether it was 500 foot or a mile or half a mile or whatever distance adjacent to the railroad. Even assuming the 500 foot is a good marker, if we simply took those rules, business rules in place for the entirety of the short line to its terminus, and then, you know, excluding schools, excluding critical areas that are already conserved, excluding residential areas, parks, looking at the GIS overlay that's within 500 feet, what land is left? Are there parcels left to zone rail industrial? And then, if there are, and I'm assuming there are, then you start assessing those residual parcels for, well, is this a good use? Is it a compatible use? Does it comply with FRDU? It would seem that would be a better process as far as instead of cutting the short line, which is already limited in economic development potential because it's a short line, it doesn't connect to anything. You know, cutting it in half just makes it that much more limited. So as far as process, what prevents us from doing that GIS overlay to its terminus and then doing the environmental assessment that you said was lacking?
Councilors, I think that would be, if that is the direction of this council, that is the next things that staff will look into. And that is the only thing I will add, because even if you were to direct staff to do that now, it will still require an extensive environmental review and also an extensive public outreach. You're correct that the decision that the previous council made was we got to start somewhere and start where an environmental review have already occurred so that we will not expose the county to other risk. So for that, for example, litigation. So we followed the directive of the council at the time. So if this current council want us to go beyond this area, then additional work, extensive outreach, mapping, because it's going to be a plan amendment because you're going to be applying an overlay to the entire area that you've identified qualifies. So that is going to be the next steps. If that is the direction of the council, that you want this to go beyond this area and maintain the 500 feet on both sides of the railroad, that is an undertaking that future work will entail.
Thank you.
I've got a quick question before we move forward. Can I ask exactly what happens to a parcel that gets an overlay, a rail overlay? So for example, we have multiple different designations there, different zonings listed. We have residential, we have public space, we have industrial. What exactly does the overlay do?
The overlay provides an option to develop the property for the yet to be developed uses that would be allowed under the freight rail ordinance when it gets adopted. At this point, it doesn't do anything without a use list, and no one can do anything related to freight rail because there's no ordinance adopted that tells you what you can do. There's no use list that has been adopted. So at this point, there's not a lot that it does.
Okay, thank you.
Chair, I have a question. So the industrial rail designation, is that only in urban areas? Is that only possible in urban areas? Because it seems like that could open up some opportunities.
So the industrial rail is a different, it's code language that was created for kind of this area, but was never, I don't know, was it applied originally in the 07 or 16?
I can't remember.
It was never applied to any property, but it was developed for, in anticipation of this land being used, a railroad industrial use adjacent to the railroad. But it was never applied by council to any properties. And it's different from the overlay because that's a specific zone, whereas the overlay allows you to apply this on resource land. The issue we've had historically with resource land, the ag, is that when we go to de-designate it, we get challenged, and we've ended up losing at the hearings board and in court on the de-designation process. And so this legislation is essentially kind of a workaround that allows for these uses to occur on resource land, both ag and forest, without having to change the zoning.
Right. Thanks for that explanation, because that's what I really thought all along, that the legislation was a workaround because the Rural Industrial Land Bank failed under an appeal. And so now what I'm hearing you say is that agricultural land or forest land, resource land sounds like up for grabs, really.
The way that the bill is crafted, it says that Clark County, in this case, and Okanogan County, if they choose to, may apply this bill to those resource areas and allow whatever use the communities or the counties come up with to implement the bill. So you are correct. The other thing I will add is that the railroad traverses further to the south in the urban area. So direction or directive have been given to staff to apply the overlay or the railroad bill to the properties that are in the urban area. Those properties in the urban area are already zoned for light industrial, for example. But if that's the direction from the future, from the council to look at the entire 33-mile, that is additional work that will be undertaken.
And back to that point about urban services in rural areas, I followed this legislation when it was adopted, and bills aren't amended, by accident, that this was deliberate language that was put in there with the intention of limiting its application because it was allowing for uses on resource lands. And I believe the majority of the committee and the legislature that adopted this, and they had tried several times to pass this, it got passed because it was narrowed, and the narrowing was not extending urban services. And I don't believe that we have the ability to change that. It seems to me new legislation would have to be introduced to change that.
So we could get bogged down in that debate, and I think ultimately it would take a legislative amendment, which I thought we were trying to put in process at some point, or a court decision. And certainly I've heard from from the legislatures on the Democratic side that supported this bill and said exactly the opposite from what Sue Marshall just said as a history. Both sides are reasonable to argue, and I think the bill internally is somewhat inconsistent with that language you focused on. So it's going to take some more work to depend on what our legal position is and what chance we have before a court in moving forward, or getting the legislature to address the ambiguity in this, what I would consider a hybrid cutout beyond the urban growth boundary, which I think the legislation was pretty clear it intended to do. I did want to touch on the question that Sue did ask, because I never connected the failed industrial land bank with this legislation. And I'll take it for granted that there may be some connection. I would doubt it, though, just because of the Democratic sponsorship and a Democratic governor signing this bill. However, what you were just talking about as far as an environmental review and assessment of those parcels that could be rezoned, if they were resource lands, wouldn't that come into the assessment? I mean, if they were forested or agricultural uses that were in existence today, wouldn't that be part of the environmental assessment as to whether or not they could or should be rezoned?
Jose, go ahead. I will add if I have to.
So I'd be cautious to use the term rezoning, because
Yes.
the issue is we're applying an overlay. So the underlying zoning is intended to stay. So the agriculture will stay, the forest will stay, an overlay will be placed on it that will allow additional uses. The rezoning would involve potential de-designation, and that's going to be problematic, I'm thinking. So with that said, when you're looking at the environmental, we're trying to balance these uses for agriculture and forestry, and the amendment allows this, but we've included language in our policies that we'll get to in a moment to try to maintain that balance, because the state requires us to protect these natural resources, but it's also allowing us to use these lands for these freight rail dependent uses as long as they're adjacent to the railroad. So trying to maintain that balance is one of the challenges in developing the code language. And yes, I think that would be addressed when you're looking at an environmental assessment, and that's something that hasn't been done for a lot of these areas outside of this.
So I just want to, so resource lands, whether forest or agriculture, are they up for grabs or are they not up for grabs? If they're up for grabs, there would be a process to evaluate each and every one. Is that what I'm taking from your answer?
I think the only thing that's up for grabs is what's along the rail line beyond this urban area or beyond this area that's been identified. So when you go further north, if you're going to look at both ag and forest, because that's what's going to be there, that has to be evaluated.
Just one more comment. Just looking at the map, and what had been identified is over 600 acres of prime ag. That's the overlay that's been identified.
I think, Councillor, that our estimation of this total outlying red area is about 300 acres. Is that correct?
Yes. The other thing that I would point out is that these areas in blue, I don't know if you can see my arrow, these are, this goes back to when the map was created, we still had the industrial land bank. And
Yes.
so subsequently, these areas have turned back to orange, which is the agriculture designation.
Thank you.
Next slide, please. So again, in 2018, this is the land use element that added the freight rail dependent use overlay, consistent with what's in the bill. Next slide. Again, so there was in the rural and natural resource element, there was one new goal and 3 policies that were added to the rural and natural resources element, 3.91, 3.92 here, and then on the next slide. Is 3.9.3, and this is the similar language that was in that transportation section element. Next slide, please. Again, these were the transportation element new policy, and I believe there were 1 new policy and 7 new strategies that were added to the transportation element, looking at freight rails sort of more broadly. Next slide. Yeah, it's a continuation of the transportation element strategies. Next slide. So as we get into phase 2, the development uses and standards, phase 2 of the project began with the creation of an advisory committee that was essentially a subcommittee of the Railroad Advisory Board with 3 additional members representing the Farm Bureau, the Parks Advisory Board, and the Brush Prairie Neighborhood Association. The committee met 6 times between March and June of 2018. And I think the neighborhood representative from the Brush Prairie Neighborhood Association resigned after the 2nd meeting. The committee's charge is there on the right. It is to consider and recommend development regulations related to the freight rail dependent uses. Next slide, please. So again, these are the 4 components of the committee's recommendations in greater detail. The overlay map expansion and 1 mile corridor. There's a development use list that was created, building and development standards, and sewer extension with recommendations from the advisory committee. The area outlined in red is the existing overlay, which is about 300 acres. That was adopted in January 2018. The area in, I think it looks like green in this map, are parcels within a mile of the railroad between Vancouver and Battlegrounds UGA. I think this was about 6,000 acres. The committee felt that the area in red was too small to get any significant economic development because it didn't include all of the areas that had been previously designated for a rural industrial land bank, which includes most of the Lagler Dairy. At the committee's June 6th meeting, they decided to define adjacent as parcels within 1 mile of the railroad, and that the overlay would apply to the entire 1 mile area. At the last meeting on June 20th, the committee decided to scale back the overlay, and that's represented by the hash marks, and that was about 2,100 acres to account for some of the smaller parcels in the area, the proximity to Salmon Creek on the north, some of the publicly owned properties, including schools and parks. The committee was unable to come up with a definition of adjacent to reflect the change in the overlay map, so they left the definition at 1 mile. Next slide, please. So the public review and comment, we had, due to the expansion of adjacent to 1 mile, we sent out 1,500 mailers to try to encompass as many of the property owners within that area. We put ads in the Columbian and Reflector. We had an open house at Hawkinson High School on August 30th. There was a Brush Prairie Neighborhood Association meeting September 20th. We had a web survey and information that was provided. We emailed stakeholders and used Nextdoor to reach folks, and had a 30-day comment period, which is double our usual 15-day comment period. We did have more than 600 online surveys that were submitted, and most of the respondents, 77%, were dissatisfied with the proposed overlay, 79% within the corridor, and 79% within the 1 mile corridor area. The property owners who responded, who had property located in the 1 mile corridor area, 85% would have preferred to have their property removed from the expansion area. Of the respondents with property in the proposed overlay, 84% responded that they would prefer to be removed from the overlay area. Approximately 80% of the respondents were dissatisfied with the permitting of chemical manufacturing, asphalt paving mixture, and block manufacturing, and plastics and rubber products manufacturing. In looking at the entire use list, over 70% of the respondents were not satisfied with either the permitted or conditional uses as recommended by the advisory committee. Next slide, please. So this is a summary of the project's timeline from when the bill was passed in October of 2017 through the work of phase 1, followed by an overview of phase 2, concluding with the last conversation with council in October of 2018. Next slide, please. So we had a council work session September 26, 2018 to provide some options for the bill implementation. There are 6 options that were discussed with council at the work session, and those are listed here, and some probable timelines for completion. The next slide will show you what direction council gave at their October 3rd council time. They wanted to proceed to a joint hearing between the council and the planning commission. They didn't want to see a change to the January 9th overlay map. They wanted draft development regulations that that showed an inclusion and exclusion of heavy industrial uses, and a consideration for all uses being conditional. They also wanted a draft amendment of the comprehensive plan and Title 40 to allow sewer for freight rail dependent uses, and they wanted to have the planning commission consider these proposals. Next slide, please. And almost 3 weeks later, October 23rd, council issued a press release that postponed public hearings on freight rail dependent uses with those 3 statements as for the rationale for the delay in 2019. And that concluded the any additional work on this, on the implementation of the bill at this point. Next slide. And I do have an updated slide that I will pass along to Tina so that we can update the web page that includes 2 links that will take you to the overview of the project, the rail dependent uses, and all of the meetings and information that have gone on, and then also to the work that was done by the advisory committee and their 6 meetings, the summaries of all of that, all of the information that was presented to them. And I think there was, we recorded, I think, all but one of those meetings. I'm open to take questions and comments from council.
Yep. So, Madam Chair, if I may, just I think we need to move with alacrity, but due diligence. And I think we need to come up.
If you could just move your mic a little closer to you. Thank you.
Okay, sorry, I was leaning the wrong way away from the microphone. I think we need to move with alacrity, but due diligence. And, you know, basically this has all been stalled since 2017. And I think in part, prior councils just didn't have the political will to move forward after these open houses were held, and there was a lot of very reasonable consternation by local residents that would be impacted. You know, first and foremost, this is it's kind of a mismatch in law when you have an industrial area cutting across the most rural part of our county and outside the urban growth boundaries that we've set. I mean, it's just a hard fit just to begin with. On the other hand, this could really create jobs, family wage jobs in the North County area. It would help alleviate the need for additional corridors and relieve the congestion that we have people from the North County commuting all the way to Portland, which is really a shame. We need local good jobs. And economic development is certainly a goal of this legislation. But I think as far as a pragmatic step, because I have never seen it, I've only had conversation about it. And, you know, and I've participated in those myself, from speaking with a prior manager who's felt that this legislation, the issue just focusing on sewer, was a poison pill. His opinion, and he was a lawyer, at least in a former life, was that this legislation could never be carried out because there are very precious few businesses of that scale that are going to build a factory or some other industrial facility that would then build its own wastewater treatment plant. You know, in speaking to some of the legislators that were involved in this process, I heard just the opposite. Oh no, that was never intended. There's no issue with sewer. And so the language that I focused on and that you put up on the screen, and I'm still looking at it, I'm now looking in the definition section, you know, boils down to what's defined as urban government services, and I think sewer is probably within it. I'll need to parse through that, but the bottom line I'm coming up with, because I'm a lawyer by trade, and I've provided legal support to agencies and commands with cities and counties and other countries, and I've also been the recipient of that legal support. I've never seen a legal analysis of this in writing by anyone, and I've been searching from MSRC, the AG's office, courts that are opinions that are readily available, and certainly nothing by our local legal office as to what, you know, how would a court view this? Clearly the intent was to provide development of this rail line with rail industrial use. It even says you can change regulations to make it happen. And it is an exception to the Growth Management Act normal restrictions outside the urban growth boundary. That's all pretty clear from the intent of the legislation. But then to say, but you can't hook it up to government services is a contradiction. So I think we need, before we invest a lot of time in this, we need a legal opinion on how would a court view this. And I tried to take that view. You know, I went back to my law school days and looked at what are normal rules of convention for interpreting legislation. And certainly, as a judge, you look for internal consistency, intent. You try to make all the pieces fit. This isn't a standalone legislation. It's embedded within the Growth Management Act. So we need that legal opinion, because that'll inform us as to whether, well, boy, this is of limited utility and it's not worth the effort. Or we need to go back to the legislature in earnest with a proposal on how to clean this up. And Oliver, I did follow up with, you know, I saw your frustration with Okanagan County, so I started on my own path. I talked to their planners up there. And essentially, I got the same response you did. Radio silence. Not one of their planners was knowledgeable or willing to talk about it. I was told that their chair of their commission, their county commission, would call me back, and they've never called me back. So I don't know if there's only one other county that was impacted by this law. I don't know what, if anything, they ever did with it. And probably at this point, I'm assuming they didn't either need to use it, or they didn't use it, or they ran into roadblocks such as we're looking at. So, I mean, I think we need to get to the heart of the issue. Is this going to be worth it? The other side issue that I've been exploring that I don't have an answer to, I called the wrong agency, the FRA. They're really about safety. And by the way, they say there are a lot of grants for our railroad crossings if we would just ask for them. But the issue is, because we've heard it from the operator, this is a heavily regulated federal area, and he believes he's got kind of extraordinary powers as a railroad to get rights of way on his own, outside of county processes. I don't know if that's true or not. I haven't been able to find out from a reliable source yet what federal law may provide either help or not. And that genesis was my idea that other legislators locally supported. It's a railroad right-of-way. It is adjacent to those utilities. And you could use the railroad right-of-way for those utilities. It would be a perfect fit to connect sewer wherever it's adjacent to the railroad, up and down the railroad to those properties adjacent to the railroad. As part of the legal analysis, I think there should be some legal analysis here. I mean, common sense tells me adjacent means touching. Touching by the ability to put a spur. You know, if you're putting a spur through several properties because you're reaching out a mile, that seems to be not so adjacent, at least in the common usage of the word. So I know there was a little consensus or resolution on that issue. To me, it seems far simpler that if it's a connected parcel by spur, that's adjacent. But in any case, for me, because I'm a lawyer, or used to be, I would like to see a legal opinion outlining these issues and look for precedent, if there is any, on how a court would construe this. And if the bottom line is we can't use this legislation because of the inability to connect to government services, then we need to either drop the action or we need to go back to the legislature with a proposal on what that amendment would look like.
Thank you, Councilor Medvigi. And if we ultimately get 3 thumbs up on the idea of having a legal opinion, I will look to the council to focus that legal opinion so that it is not all over the map, This is a very large topic area, and if that legal opinion were to be focused, it would be more helpful or would become possibly helpful. I have a question regarding that litigation. You know, litigation can be made to be interpreted to be independent from other actions that are going on, or interdependent or dependent. I mean, it can be interpreted and actually used in many different ways. One of the bullets on the council direction from October 2018 council time was to amend the comprehensive plan and Title 40 to allow sewer for the FRDU. That was apparently stopped. I presume that that was stopped because of the litigation. Is that correct? And if it was or if it wasn't, precisely why was that stopped? Where would it be now that that could simply be picked up and allowed to fly?
Councillors, what I will add is that the directive from the councillors at the time, as Jose indicated, was to draft a language for the Planning Commission and the public to weigh in on. When the council directed that there be a pause because of the lawsuit, as you stated, there was never a joint Planning Commission and Council hearing on that proposal to draft a language. The same is true for the bullet, the second bullet on this slide, which was also to draft development regulations, including or excluding industrial uses, and to consider whether all uses should be conditional. That draft also never went anywhere. So all that work didn't occur because, again, as you stated, because of the lawsuit. Now, as you know, when we go to a hearing and having the Planning Commission and the Council, the idea of the joint Planning Commission and Council hearing, which is often very rare, was for both the Planning Commission and the Council to hear the same testimony, the same concerns, and then the Planning Commission leaves and deliberate and make a recommendation to you, and then you consider the recommendation of the Planning Commission. As I stated earlier, even if we take a draft language, both on the development regulation and this idea of amending Title 40 to allow sewer, that will not be the end of it, depending on what the council chooses to do. So that's why there was a stop.
Thank you. And if we could go back to the draft that you said never went anywhere on bullets 2 and 3, I presume it is filed in someone's office and could be resurrected. Is it something that could be useful at this point in time? And if no, why not?
If that's what the council directs that we
excuse me, council can't direct that be used now. We haven't seen it.
Okay, we staff can provide that draft to the council for your review. And I don't know, your direction then will be, do you want them, as you're reviewing it, do you want the public to review it as well? So your call, that's what I mean by direction of the council. If you want us to provide that draft to you, we will. If you ask us to make it available so that the entire public will see that, we will do so. That's what I mean by direction of the council.
I see. Thank you. Thank you. So you're familiar with the content of that. Would you feel that that is a draft that could be made to be useful at this point in time? It surely isn't outdated, is it?
No, it's not outdated. It will have the same issues that Councilor Medvigi is raising. Staff is not taking any position on whether this bill allows sewer or not. We will only tell the council, if you prefer, in executive session or in any other format, what our own reading of the bill is. We can do that. But right now, we are not taking any position one way or the other. Similarly, staff is not taking any position on whether any of the uses, when you see it, whether they should include or exclude heavy industrial, or whether all the uses should be conditional. We're not taking any position on that either. So that is all open for conversation and discussion.
Today, correct?
Because you haven't seen the draft development regulations and the draft language to amend Title 40 to allow sewer, we will have conversation on that when you see the drafts, and your direction of whether that is limited to the council or whether you want the public to see that. That's going to be your call, councilors. We have the drafts.
Great. And what I was saying was not that we would make a decision on the content of the drafts, because we haven't seen those, as you so correctly point out, but that we could make a decision today on whether or not those drafts would be shared with council. Is
Yes,
that correct?
Yes,
Yeah,
you can.
very good.
Yeah, you can. You can cancel, or you can at a council time, either one.
What other questions does council have, or comments?
I have some comments just related to the urban services and why that's important. I think it's a fundamental tool related to the prevention of sprawl, that's why we're not extending urban services beyond growth boundaries, because then there's the tendency to sprawl. And I think back to that joint meeting we had with, I believe, the Planning Commission and the cities, where the Department of Commerce was talking about, when we're going into comprehensive planning, first thing to think about is your infrastructure and what you can afford. And so I'd like folks to realize there'd be a big price tag if we start extending urban services beyond growth boundaries. So I think that's a fundamental principle within the Growth Management Act that has enabled there to be protection of resource lands. A concern about, I think, agricultural land in particular, even though the zoning remains the same, I'd wonder how we actually protect that use when the overlay is applied. And the thing with natural resources or wetlands, there's mitigation opportunities, so it can result in no net loss. But with agriculture and these prime ag lands, when they're gone, and we don't have a mechanism in place, although I think we could look to find what those mechanisms might be to mitigate for loss of agricultural land, because as is, it'll just get challenged. So that's a concern. And I think we need to proceed cautiously, just given, and Jose, I'm glad you talked about the reaction from the community. I mean, that can instruct us going forward that 85% wanted an overlay to be removed. Now, maybe it was just extended too far, and that was part of the problem, or it wasn't clear what the uses would be, but I think it behooves us to take great care and engage the community along the railroad in this decision making. I think the Rail Advisory Committee. They are super boosters for the railroad, but it's the people who are living alongside that will be heavily impacted. And I think we've seen quite clearly and vocally when there was that change in zoning to industrial rail and the opportunity for a cement plant to be located, just the impact next to residential that will be profound. So I guess my advice would be to proceed very cautiously, and I would not be supportive of extending urban services outside of urban areas. Thanks.
So I was going to comment on exactly the same point that Sue Marshall did, but from an opposite point of view. So let me address the last point you just made. It's very evident to me, it's been a real eye-opener since becoming a counselor, that no matter what we do on any topic, anywhere in the county, there is a direct and loud opposing voice. So, as to public comment, I can tell you I would anticipate every inch of development along the railroad is going to be met by opposition of people that live in those areas. Our responsibility is broader than that. Absolutely, do we need to hear it? Yes. Because sometimes we miss things. You know, this is all about location and the kinds of uses. And obviously from the legislation itself, it prohibited some use of the railroad. And we could further refine that, and we need to and will. And I know the staff has already done a great deal of work in that regard. It's location, location, location. What's going to be compatible, what's not, what's going to be compatible if there are conditions on use made that make it a good neighbor. But we can always expect something like 85% when you of people opposing it, because we hear it all the time on everything, whether it's a cell tower or an airport operation. There's always objection. Not in my backyard is a true saying. So, but we have a broader view. We need to look at economic development and health for the entire county. Now, as to urban services, putting on my judge's hat, trying to read these sections compatibly to fulfill the intent of the actual legislation that the governor signed, it's not an impediment. Because what the definition defines is city-like urban services. It doesn't add to sprawl. That's an argument that some make. But the legislation to some extent does that by saying, hey, we're going to go beyond the urban growth boundary. There are services of the kind, whether it's water or sewer, perhaps even stormwater, that are adjacent to the railroad. They're already there. It just needs the connection. So to narrowly read that definition, it doesn't limit it, because we're not creating a whole septic system, as the word is commonly used, out beyond the urban growth boundary. The septic system is, you know, we have separate districts. They have plans to push out as growth does move, but it's already there. The system's already there. This is just a connection to it through a railroad right-of-way would be the most simple solution. So again, it gets down to legal interpretation to make sense of the statute that the governor signed. And again, if we can't make sense of it here locally, then maybe we need to ask in earnest for an amendment.
Just for the benefit of council, I'm making a list of things that we should consider based on our discussions. engage with staff at the nearing the end of the work session, so that we take advantage of staff time in a positive way and give the direction that we wish to give. So whatever is in your mind that should be on that list, please be formulating it. I have only 2 items at this point, but I'm happy to take any time. So it looked like you had a thought a moment ago, Councilor Young.
Yes, I've had thoughts since slide 4. All right, I do have a few questions. Thank you for the presentation. It was very helpful in giving us a good history and update to what's taken place over the time. I do have a few remaining questions, and we'll be doing some individual research on my own as well. But I did have a question. Now, this word keeps coming up, and I am curious as to its definition legally, and that word is dependent. Freight dependent. What is freight dependent? Because, and I mean, I don't know rail and I don't know industry that much, but I can't imagine that there are too many things that cannot be produced without the access to rail. So I was curious about that.
Do you have that in the RCW to call up right now, staff?
It's not defined in the RCW.
What was that? I didn't hear that.
The term dependent is not defined in the RCW. I think that was one of the things we struggled with
Yes.
our committee was what exactly is that going to mean for us? Does that mean only things that can come to and from a site are dependent on? Or is it, and I know we had that discussion, I know that seemed overly restrictive because there's changes in industry where sometimes you, depending on the circumstance, you may use rail, but there are times where it may be more beneficial to use trucks. So they didn't want, my recollection is they didn't want to have that broad of a restriction, that it only be things that get shipped or that can all, that it's so restrictive, it's just only using the rail.
So it sounds like we probably should do a little bit of legal research on that as well. It doesn't seem to be very defined.
It's pretty clear, I think.
Okay.
Yeah.
If staff thinks that that's clear, then I won't move that forward. It just is unclear to myself. So, okay. Then I did have a question, and it was brought up several times, and you may or may not have the answer, but you had mentioned that industrial rail, that zone was never assigned per se. And so we know of a recent instance where one parcel was rezoned to that. Are there any other examples of that happening? Are there any other properties zoned industrial rail at this point?
We have at least 2. We're still looking at the map, but 2 in addition to the 1, so 3 right now. Yes.
Okay, great, thank you. And then I would, kind of about this whole discussion that we've had, I do feel like, I do agree with Gary on that before we invest a lot of resource and time and effort into this, I think there are some things that do need to be clarified legally. So I would definitely be supportive of that, getting an exact detail. And if we are not at the point where anything really is feasible due to that, then if the council feels like we still want to move forward, then at that time we work on working with the legislature at that point. But yeah, I do agree that as much as I want to go through this process and get closure on it, I do think that it is important that we not potentially waste resources. And I also would like for us to look into the cost of potentially bringing services into the urban area if we are looking into that, and how that would work, who would fund that. I'm imagining it would be expensive and probably something that we don't have access to at this point. So are there grants available? Would there be a way for us to tie that expense to the development, or would that be cost prohibitive and ruin the feasibility of this project? So I think those issues are important. And I would like to also at the same time as we're getting legal help with this also, and let me ask first, in the past, have we had any, like, economic development advice from various groups or consultation companies that have been able to, determine feasibility of this economically?
Councillors, we haven't asked, and, going forward, I will be, depending on the direction of the council, I may seek that opportunity in consultation with the county manager. There is no funding for us to do anything or to seek consultant help at this point.
Okay, to me, that seems like it should be something that we should explore prior also to digging into this. And I believe, the last thing I would say is that, it does not appear that we're at a point where we're starting to considerably move forward, but before we do get to that point, I just wanted to make sure that 8-year-old outreach information for me is insufficient, and it's unfortunate, and I think that we need to go through the process again to make sure. A lot of things have changed in 4 or 5 years, so I think that's a very important thing to consider. Thank you.
Could I double tap on that, Madam Chair? Because I had that on my list of things to discuss. So 2 things that Glenn just raised I think are really important. I notionally said, hey, we can connect to services that are already out there along the rail line. I don't know that for a fact. I don't know that what the costs would be involved. So I think some level of detail on that as part of the chair's list would be valuable. The other thing I had wanted to mention, I listened to the actual hearing back in 2018 by the council when they paused this. And you didn't mention this, Oliver, but it simply was, it ultimately paused because, hey, there's a whole brand new council coming on board in January. And so they kind of kicked the can. That was well before the litigation with the operator started. So that gets to the issue of political will. Now, I had been asked, I think during one of my campaigns, okay, what do you think about the rail dependent? What does it look like as far as public outreach for that? And my position publicly, and it remains today, is we need to restart. If we are going to do this in earnest, we need to restart the public outreach process. And something that's come up before for this council that's been kind of uniformly rejected, I'm not a fan of it, but, if you really want to put it to the people, an advisory vote is available. And just put it to the county. Do you want to pursue this economic development? Do you want to pursue this opportunity? Or forego it? That's something to consider. It isn't cheap, and I don't know what that figure is, but when we were talking about fireworks, we talked about advisory votes, and I think the auditor told us it'd be about 80 grand or so just to get it on the ballot. I don't know that that's an accurate figure, but that's something to talk about. If you want to just not take a leadership position here, hey, we have a law, let's put it in place. If we'd rather say we were handed a law by the state, but we don't know if Clark County citizens support it, an advisory vote is one avenue to pursue.
Councilor Marshall.
Thank you. Yeah, just a couple of things here. I like the idea of having an economic development plan so we could look at, what kinds of businesses do we want to attract that would not create as many conflicts. Rail is for bulk goods, though, and what's been talked about so far is an asphalt plant, a cement plant, aggregate, and garbage. So I don't know how many jobs those industries would create, but I think having some sense of an economic development plan and what we're trying to attract, and I think there's reason, sometimes you need to be patient. It takes time for businesses to locate here. I do think the rail is an important asset for the county. It's a good way to move goods, and that's more efficient than trucking. And, you know, trucking has a lot of impacts in the neighborhoods as well. So, you know, we may not have the resources to do an economic development plan, but, you know, maybe the Rail Advisory Committee or others, maybe we can, and CREDEC, we could look at what would be suitable along the rail. So as for my list of things to look at, you know, a legal opinion on extension of urban services is on the list, and protection and or mitigation of resource lands, what that might look like going forward, if the intention is still to have that resource land zoning overlay on the property. Oh, and then I would be interested in, within the existing legislation, and assuming that you cannot extend urban services, what could be accommodated in terms of industry along the railroad? I'm not sure about an advisory vote, because I think I feel like we're dependent on the rail operator to take care of the railroad for us, and that's not something that we're able to do within our county. So I think there's maybe it's some codependency there that we have to be aware of. So, anyway, it may take time to sort through all of this, and I feel like people may already have developed camps that they're in, but I think we need to, you know, keep working on this and talking with each other, and I think this has been productive conversation today.
Other comments from council?
Only to respond to, you know, and I think staff is guilty of this as well early on, kind of throwing out the most inflammatory possible uses of a railroad. You mentioned kind of in passing that railroads save it's green. I mean, a gallon of fuel moves a whole lot of bulk and gets it off our roads and is friendly. It has less of a carbon footprint than trucking. And anything that goes on a truck can go on a train. So there's a lot of good environmental reasons to push the use of the railroad to get, and so some of the original uses, let's look at that. Timber, lumber, even had passengers to some extent since the late 1800s. You know, so we're not talking about a nuclear power plant, although that seems to be coming in favor generally, even amongst those with a green state of mind. Asphalt plants, I mean, that was accentuated and accentuated. I don't know of any actual intent to put an asphalt plant in Battleground. I mean, but so there's a lot of clean industry out there. And yeah, it would be great to know who is coming here. And I've been pressing the operator, because over the years, the operator says, oh my gosh, if you guys would just move on this, I have all these great businesses that want to move in. Never seen them, never heard from them, and CREDEC is precluded for privacy reasons of letting us know who's expressed an interest. But there is an infinite number of clean industry with high-paying jobs that we could. There are already users, by the way, along the rail line, using the rail line productively. But yeah, it would be great if we had an economic policy advisor. It would be great if we had more information from CREDEC. It would be great if we knew in advance who was ready in the wings to come if our railroad was renovated and through its entire course and put to use. I think that comes later. In any case, those are my thoughts. I'd like to focus on the infinite number of good industry that could be put to use along the railroad, not just things that get people upset.
Councilor Young.
Yeah, one last little comment that I forgot to mention was and I believe Councilor Marshall had touched on this a little bit, but I think it is absolutely critical that when we are looking at this, that we are considering impacts and making sure that we are aware of those, first of all, and that our code does the best job on its own without having to go through major hearing process and stuff to eliminate some of those unacceptable impacts. I think that something like this can be done, for sure. I can see this being potentially a valuable tool. I think we have some more investigating to do to ensure that, but I think we need to be careful with where we locate various facilities and such, making sure that it does blend with the surrounding areas and that there are buffers between those areas and residential areas. So I just think that's something that's a critical thing that we need to pay attention to as we move along in this process.
Let's see if we can come up with a small number of bullets of things that we would like to request of staff. The things that I believe we universally have on the list, but I need to check that with you, is a legal opinion. And Sue, you focused that well on the extension of urban services. Is that what you would all like to see on the list?
And I'd recharacterize that as connection to existing urban services, because there's a difference. We're not building a whole septic system out in Amboy or Yakult. What we're talking about is septic systems that are already there, connecting to it, to make these properties viable economically.
Okay. I would also just ask, when we ask for a legal opinion, there are many ways of going about that, and one of them is having a really fancy legal study done externally that costs a fortune. That's not what I have in mind. How about you all?
What did you have in mind?
Something done in-house.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear what your answer was to Glenn.
In-house.
Oh, so is the question hiring another law firm to write a legal opinion?
Well, if we have any guidance to staff on how to go about getting this legal opinion, what is that? Request or advice?
Well,
Go ahead.
So I have been very critical of some of the opinions we've gotten before, that there was no precedent, no legal analysis. It's just verbatim, this is what the word says kind of opinion. I would like something more, kind of like a law review article, something that's documented, something that you would expect from an outside law firm if you ask them to pursue the topic. And a great example is Spokane County, when the county council hired a firm to address the opinions of the Ninth Circuit on how to deal with homelessness. That was a really 20-page memorandum that looked at the case law and analyzed it, just as you want any other lawyer to do. There may be AG opinions out there. I don't know. I haven't found them. There may be MSRC work that's already been done on this. I don't know. I haven't been able to find it. I wish we had gotten some word back from Okinawa as to their experience, but we haven't, and that's kind of a lost cause. But I would like a fairly detailed, well thought out, and annotated legal opinion on where we stand on this issue.
Just to comment, I think that's a great idea, and when I say in-house, I'm referring to the very capable lawyers that PVJR has available to them, as well as what we have available to us. And I point to you, Leslie Lopez. So anyway, that's what I have in mind. And rather than the expensive approach that could be taken.
Council, if I may, this is Leslie Lopez. I just need to jump in when we're talking about legal opinions given to the council. I believe we've talked about this before, but if not, I just want to make sure it's clear that under the statute, the prosecuting attorney's office is given the duty to provide legal advice to the county, including the county counselors. And if the council, the prosecuting attorney would have to approve hiring a special counsel to provide a legal opinion. So my suggestion would be that we handle this in our own office, and we are certainly more than capable of providing the information you need. When we get down to it, Chris Cook is on the line, and she will likely ask just clarifying questions to make sure we're looking at the exact questions you have.
Perfect. And Councilor Marshall?
Well, you mentioned PVJR's attorney giving an opinion, and I think that I would have a problem with that. I think they're in a conflicted position.
Well, so are we, but there's a counterpoint that it takes to interpret any legal information that comes to us. I think just because we have a 20-page legal opinion in front of us does not mean that this is gospel. It means that we bring our own understanding and interpretation to it. And we would do that regardless of the source. I would hope that we would do it even for a fancy external firm.
So I absolutely would welcome if PVJR is willing to go to the cost of doing it, and it's in their interest to do so. But I agree with Leslie, at least as I understand the law and have heard interpretations before. We are not free to go and hire someone, whether it's from PVJR or elsewhere. So, I mean, I'd like to take a first stab with the PA's office, but at the same time, invite PVJR. I don't know if they're listening to this hearing, but if they've got the wherewithal to delve into these legal issues, I'd welcome a memorandum from them.
So real quickly, my comments on this is I agree. I welcome the railroad to bring their own information to us, but I do agree with Sue Marshall that we should have an independent opinion on this. And not being the attorney that I am, I just know that sometimes it takes longer to research things than the value. Sometimes it becomes more expensive to do the research to figure out than it is to go to a specialist. So I don't know if there is an outside specialist, but I mean, I would prefer to have somebody that, I mean, this is a really weird issue. I mean, how often is this happening? Probably never. So I don't know how we go about that, but I do understand we defer to the PA's office. So however you can help us best with this, we appreciate it.
Thank you, Council. I appreciate the discussion. And I think moving forward, as I mentioned, I think the best thing to do at this point would be to really clarify the exact issues you want researched. And then I'll have, if Chris Cook is online, she can ask a question about that just to make sure we're hitting exactly what it is you're asking for. Mm-hmm. I didn't know if there were other things on the list that you were looking at to have researched at this point.
From a legal perspective, TBD. Sometimes it ends up in that legal ballpark more quickly than we know. So the topic area that we've identified is on the extension of urban services and the connection to existing septic. Is that correct, Council?
Yeah, it's paragraph 27 of the definitions and how that squares with the intent, stated intent at the beginning of the statute as to what they intended with this rail-dependent use. But I agree with Glenn. I'm hopeful that you'll look at this and say, boy, we really need an outside expert who knows rail law, because federal law may impact this as well, as I mentioned. And so I would keep an open mind to that. And all the points that we've discussed here, you shouldn't ignore and just focus on this definition. But that is the crux, that's the focus of this, and has been since I've been a counselor. Can we hook up to the existing sewer systems along the rail line to make those properties valuable? In light of the intent of this statute and the definitions it provides in the GMA. You know, one of the definitions, Oliver, that you provided to me that was the substance of the argument had to do with transportation. And I read that, okay, under the GMA, if you're focused on development along the rail line just for transportation purposes, that was pretty defined. You cannot extend government services. So that to me seemed consistent with, but you can everywhere else if it's for economic development and rail-dependent uses, not just limited to transportation. So there's some legal work that needs to be delved into, including the federal law, beyond just this one paragraph. But that, I mean, that's been the objection from the managers from the beginning. I think it's stalled the council since 2017. We need an answer.
Leslie, you had mentioned Chris Cook being online. I just want to say, Chris, do you have anything that you would like to say? Because we've heard Chris opine in this area before, and I thought maybe she would like to now. Chris, are you listening?
Thank you, Chair Bowerman. I am online, and it seems to me that what you are looking for is a legal opinion regarding urban services. And that is what I think, and I've heard at least 3 counselors, maybe 4, say that that is what they desire to have. So that is what I would be working on. And until I get working on that and come up with a product for you, I don't think I would be comfortable discussing, taking a position on anything that anybody has said at this point.
Anything else before we move to bullet number 2? That was bullet number 1.
So there is one item I might want to bring up, and that is the draft. No, I'm sorry. I will go back. That's the extent of my input at this point. Not much.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
I heard Councillor Young.
Yeah, just one last little thing when we're talking about being specific here. I would want to be careful when we're talking about existing sewer system, because I don't know how that works. I mean, that's quite a ways away, and the stuff's got to drain downhill. So I don't know what they consider new and existing. I think we should just be careful with that and just let it be open-ended and see what would have to be done.
Okay, let's go to bullet number 2. I had as bullet number 2 written down, actually, it is on the monitor right now for a council direction at 10/3/2018 that bullets 2 and 3 were in draft form in the office, with you, Oliver and Jose, and that they could, in fact, be shared with council. And so my bullet was to share those with council so that we could read them, study them, see what was envisioned at that time in 2018. Is there anything you'd like to add or change to that?
So I would just say number 1 and restate it, because I had said it as well as Sue Marshall. This is all about what uses and what places. Location, location, location. When I look back at and listen to some of the prior discussions and look back at the web page, that's very extensive of the work that Oliver and Jose and your team has done. I think you did a great job. I mean, we're going to have to find, if we move forward, we're going to have to, I would like, put our stamp of approval and look in finer detail on some of these allowed uses, or what would always require a conditional use, or what would be precluded. I mean, but I think right now, I don't think we're at that level of granularity, if you will, because I think you've already done a great job in kind of teeing up all those issues. So, I mean, those were approved, were they not, or were they not?
It was dropped.
So it was, okay, you're shaking your head no. That was, the work that you did in that area was not approved by the council.
It was,
Oliver,
councilors and Jose jump in, it was a recommendation in a draft form that went to the council, and their direction was take this draft to a hearing if we do have a joint hearing between the Planning Commission and the council. And part of that hearing will be consideration to whether to include or to exclude heavy industrial uses that are on the draft list, and also whether to consider all the uses to be conditional uses, to be a conditional, permitted under the conditional use process. That was what we have that no one have ever seen, but we do have the draft. Jose, do you have
So
anything
thank you.
to
And so the bullet
So-
was simply to share that draft with this council. That's what it was.
So in light of that, if we're going to move forward, we could, one, move forward with the legal opinion, which I think we've already decided, but at the same time, maybe this is worthy of a work session on that draft. So we dust it off, we send it to us, we become apprised of it, and you tell us the details of what the pros and cons were, what staff recommends. What would you think of a work session on that draft?
Let's see what it says, would be my thought.
Yeah, my initial thought process is that this information is valuable, but I feel like that I would appreciate it if staff could forward it to us, but I'm more interested in just kind of looking at it on my own time as opposed to workshop, just because we don't know if we're moving forward.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't want to consume, public time and staff time and everything for that, but I do want to dig through that information on my own personal time. That's kind of where I'm at on that.
So do we have three who are willing to have this as a bullet whereby we receive a copy of the draft? Okay, great. So is there another bullet to request staff do something out of this work session?
Yeah, I would like a work session on it. I will exercise my due diligence, as I always have, in researching what you've done. But then I want to have an interaction with staff on what they're recommending and go over it in a little bit more detail and have an open discussion with council. I think that is a prudent thing to do, to see where we're at on agreeing or disagreeing on potential uses.
And I would give that a thumbs down, I'm sorry, for right now, only because I'd like to see first what is in that draft. And then after that, I'll bet I'm with you totally, but we'll see.
Yeah, I'm in the same place. I'm 100%. I definitely want a workshop on this as soon as we get a legal opinion. And that was the other thing when you asked about a bullet point, economic viability study to some degree. I would like to see that. That's one bullet point I would like to add. I don't know if my colleagues share that same sentiment.
Economic viability of businesses that would be attracted because of the service provided by the rail?
Just a more economic viability study of what will happen if we are to do this, and then it goes along with the costs. What are the costs to do it? What's going to be the return on our investment on this?
Position's vacant. I don't think we have any capability to do an economic study on, there's plenty of national position papers. The state's done them. National Rail has done them, just as they've done it on airports. They're readily available on the internet. As far as how it pertains to Clark County, I don't know of a single person on the staff that can do that work.
I can certainly, if council wishes, I can talk to our finance team. I do know, sometimes we have a financial consultant externally that we have a contract with, but this is a little different. One option, I don't know if this is an option either, is can CREDC do that economic study? If the council wants to have this done.
Yeah, that was one of the things that I had planned to. I'm still waiting for a response from CREDC there was some discussion that we had last week as well that I was going to bring answers for, but I haven't been contacted back yet to get that information, but I can ask them if that's something that they can do. I don't know. That was one of the things I intended to ask is what our contract with CREDC covers, what all is available to us.
Yes, I can send that contract to you. I think it was signed on your first day here. I will. Are you on their board? Are you the board rep? Okay. But I can re-forward that to you.
Are there any other bullets, counselors?
A couple of bullets that I had mentioned, and one is protection. You know, what could be the measures to protect or mitigate for potential impacts to resource lands? What could some of those conditional uses look like, just to get a framework, or what would be needed? And
quick question, if I may.
Yeah.
Is that something that you would see done at the get-go, at the outset, or down the road just a bit?
Well, that's tough. I think it'd be good to have it from the get-go, because sometimes when you get down the road a little bit, you lose opportunities to implement some of these things. So, anyway, it's a concern of mine, because I think that's where the conflict, a lot of the conflict comes in my mind, related to protection of those resource lands along the route. And the other thing, and I'm not sure where this would fall, it may be part of what is economically feasible, but, you know, just looking within the existing law, and if you cannot extend those urban services, what sort of opportunities for economic development could there be?
Explain that for me a little more, if you would, please.
So what would the industries be that would not be dependent on extension of urban services in those rural areas? So if there is, for example, if there is an on-site sewage treatment thing that could be developed, or if there's wells, you know, there's exempt wells that can be drilled. I just think there's it may be not so black and white in terms of what could be allowed related to whether or not you can extend urban services. In my mind, I'm thinking there could still be businesses that could operate just fine without extending those urban services. As if, and this might be beyond Oliver and Jose's scope, but it's something would be good for us to know, so that, you know, doors aren't closed and we may not have to go back and change state law or whatever.
Thank you. So
Clear enough?
Yes, it is. Thank you. So let's get a sense of, if there's three of us who would like to see these go forward as bullets and thereby directions to staff. The first one, if I think I have it correct, measures to protect resource lands that would be taken along the route.
Yep.
So are there others who would like that to be something that is investigated by staff and comes to us at the outset?
So I'm supportive of that, but the timing I keep coming down to, really personally, all I would like to do is get a legal opinion, can we do it, and an economic opinion, can we do it? And then from there, it seems like at that point, we have a discussion as a council, okay, we have this advice now, do we want to move forward with this? And then at that point, it seems like we should then start writing out our bullet points at that point and exploring the topic as a whole. But until we get past those two giant hurdles at the beginning, it doesn't, I just don't want to put any extra resources and work into it, if that makes sense.
So I want to be clear on my position. I'm all in favor of pursuing this law, and I don't think there's any hurdle that's going to prevent us moving forward. Because
what law? The measures.
Dependent use law, I think, is ready to be applied right now, and I've got the political will to do it. What I want is these answers resolved so we can clear it up for everyone else. If the legal comes back and says, nope, can't do it, the law's messed up, it's internally inconsistent, it won't allow you to connect to septic systems, and sewer systems rather. And by the way, no business will want to invest in their own sewage treatment plant or drill wells.
I understand now. what
Yeah,
you're saying. So given that, do you want to see this as a bullet?
Okay,
For
let me finish my thought though, and I'm sorry, I'm trying to be as detailed as I can. We don't often sit here together to discuss these things, and the one-on-ones are becoming increasingly frustrating for me. So please be patient. I want to go back to, we need a work session on what we're discussing today. So I haven't, anything I've raised today, I have an interest in, and I think Sue and I have touched on the same topic as far as resource lands. And despite Jose's best efforts, I wasn't clear on the answer. So I want to reiterate again that I think we need a work session on the topics that we've brought up today, and including, are there protections in resource land? How does that process work? Is it just an environmental assessment as we're looking at individual parcels that may fall into this 500-foot adjacency definition that we've have a draft of? I think to take the next step for me is to get the legal opinion working and to schedule a work session on the issues that we're raising with you.
So, Councilor Medvigi, would you like to see measures to protect resource lands along the route as a current bullet for something that staff would be investigating and reporting back?
So, yes, but I want to know what processes are in place. I'm not talking about, okay, we need to put and come up with some protections for these resource lands, because there may already be adequate protections. I just want to know how it fits into this process of GIS and putting on a map these overlays and to individual parcels that may be forest or ag land.
Maybe I can, I'll just withdraw those last two bullets that I suggested, because I think if we're taking a step, let's just take this next step and get the bullets that we've already agreed to done, and then I think easy enough to schedule a work session once we get that information.
Once we have the additional information. Sounds good. Okay?
Well, I would like to clarify, I don't think we ever finished up the economic viability portion of this. I don't think we came to a consensus on that.
I think we said that there isn't a staff person who has that capability that we know of right now, but that Kathleen was going to touch base with Mark Dassaway's office. Is that correct, Kathleen?
Okay, and then I will do my best to look into CREDC, and perhaps we can just address this in communications or at some point.
Perfect.
Okay,
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, like it. So
along those lines, though, embedded in your comments, Glenn, and I thought we did incorporate it into bullets, as we look at the detail for where the connectivity could be to those existing services, there needs to be some feasibility on costs that the county may have to bear to open that up. So
Yeah, I do agree with that. They are kind of two separate issues. Yeah, I do think that we need to look at like the expenses of what's going to happen, and then separate from that is like an economic viability issue.
okay. Staff, Oliver and Jose, do you have clarity on where to go from here?
I think
That is the question.
That's a question. Yes, I think what I hear are two bullets. One is a legal opinion on extension of urban services. Two is to provide the draft of the development regulations as well as the draft relating to extension of sewer for the freight rail dependent uses to council for your review, and then upon that, and with the legal opinion provided to council, you may ask for a work session for additional questions that the council may have, and then from there, provide us direction. So I only see 2 bullets, and actually 3. The economic viability study, Councillor Young is going to reach out to CREDC, and the county manager will reach out to Mark Gasaway's office to see whether there is opportunity to provide economic viability study. So those are summarizing what I heard.
And those items, number 3, you don't expect staff support in doing that, do you?
Not
With
myself.
CREDC? Right.
No, I will, well.
That's.
I will reach out to them. So yes, I will take that part, and then we'll have a discussion at that point whether we want staff.
Yes.
Yes.
So Kathleen, is there anything else we need to do?
I don't think so at this time, but I do have one quick question on the discussion. So Councilor Marshall also talked about if services can't be extended, and looking at what would be allowed, as some businesses could still potentially run out there. I assume that will be done after we know if we can even extend services, and then we'll revisit that question.
That's my assumption.
Okay, thank you.
And that is consistent with what Councilor Medvici and I said, and maybe you did too, Councilor Young, I'm not sure. Okay, I believe that unless there is another comment for the good of the order from the council or the staff that was presenting today, that would bring an end to today's work session. Is that correct, or is there anything that staff or council wishes to state at this point? Hearing nothing, this what are we doing? This work session is now completed. I think we need to take about a 5-minute break and then move into council time immediately after that. And that would be, it's 10:57, let's reassemble for council time at 11:04. Thank you all so much. Thanks, staff. Great job.
Thank you, councillors.